Hello everybody. I think it's not in dispute that the organ behind me, Gloucester Cathedral organ, is one of the most famous in the country, and my colleagues and I have made a few programmes about the different families of pipes over the last few weeks, so we thought it was now time to talk about the cases, because they're rather interesting and have a very interesting history. And whatever your view, they are magnificent pieces of church furniture. There are no records about the organs in Gloucester Cathedral until the 1640s, which is quite late compared to some other cathedrals. And the first record that we have is of a payment to somebody to go to Worcester Cathedral to speak to the organist there, Thomas Tompkins, about the rebuilding of the organ here. We know that Dalham was commissioned to build an organ in Gloucester Cathedral in 1640. Now, when it was built, it stood there, not on the screen. It was built to go there, and it was only a small organ because Gloucester didn't have much money, unlike its sister cathedral at the M5, Worcester, which obviously had plenty of money. And although there's been much dispute about this, it is now thought that the organ case for the 1640 Dalham organ is the small case which sits behind me there. So for some years they thought that that was older than 1640, possibly even 16th century. But we now think it was the case that sat there. Now we're going to go for a little walk. So we've come around to St John the Baptist Chapel in the south transept, just to show you one or two bits of evidence that the organ stood here in the 17th century. And halfway up the pillar, you might be able to see quite a lot of graffiti. Now, there's graffiti and stonework all around the cathedral, as a matter of fact, but visitors always ask, how on earth does it get up there? Well, that's why, because there was a floor at this level, and the organ console would have been just there, with the player sitting with his back to the choir, and the organ up here. And so that's why bored students or singers or somebody had the opportunity to scrawl on the wall there, with the staircase starting just down there and going up in the traditional fashion. And on this side, still remaining, is one of the stone supports of the structure, presumably mostly made of wood, that originally stood here to support the organ. Underneath this breathtaking flying arch. It must have been a fantastic composition when it stood here. Well, we've come back into the choir, having been round the back there, and we just got to imagine that organ case was sitting there from about 1640. But for some reason, in the mid-1640s, it was taken down, and the Dean chapter sold it to a Mr. Yate. Nobody knows quite why the chapter took this decision, but I suspect it was to protect it, because it is a beautiful piece of work and must have cost a lot of money. Wherever it went during the Civil War, it survived, and then after the Civil War, in the 1660s, the Dean chapter bought it back again, and that's why it is preserved. The equivalent at Worcester was ransacked and destroyed, you see, so I think possibly the Dean and chapter here exercised foresight in the way that they continue to do to this day. Anyway, at some point in the early 18th century, it was decided by the chapter, but also by the city council, that the organ would be better for musical reasons, ceremonial reasons, also for accommodation reasons, if it was not there, but on the screen. And there's a nice note in the chapter records about the city council giving £50 to the cathedral to effect the dismantling of the organ there, the strengthening of the screen there, and the erection of the organ on the top there. And the organ that you see dates from the end of the 17th century. We talked about the chair organ. Above it is our magnificent great organ, which too started life there. But before I talk about the great organ, we're going for another little walk. There's no documentation about this, and there may just be speculation, but quite a few specialists in the past have thought that this screen, medieval screen here, was the original choir screen over there. And it is, you can see why they considered that it structurally wasn't strong enough to have an organ on top of it. Because it's very narrow and rather slight. But whatever, when it was moved, if it was, from there to there, it became possibly the cathedral's treasury, but we don't know. So now the organ in its totality was placed on this new screen, and you can see the Chaircase, which we talked about, and the great case, and they were skillfully put together by the famous organ builder Thomas Harris, and it was paid for by both national and local subscribers, who are memorialised by their coats of arms in various places. Obviously, you can see the most prominent one, which is carved, is the arms of the Demon Chapter of Gloucester, just in the middle on the great case. But the Chaircase, the smaller, nearer one, is generally considered to be of a higher level of workmanship, and so that's why this is considered to be pre-Civil War, and that one post-Civil War at the time of the Restoration. And there's some wonderful details. I have to get my glasses on to remember what to say. But you see the carving, rather ornate, lots of flowers and lots of fruit, and two very jolly cherubs on either side, who incidentally are much more jolly than the cherubs of the slightly later case. You see the vivid colours, golds, greens, reds. The imagery is all from the countryside. There's trees and flowers and leaves. And two curious ladies at the top who appear to be eating apples, carved there, just either side on top of the gold pipes. You see the coat of arms of various canons, prebendaries they were called, along the bottom there, all of whom gave money. And you may be interested to know, and we'll go and have a look at it in a minute, we'll go upstairs, that in that, and also in the main organ, there are reckoned to be 250 surviving metal pipes built by Harris at the same time as the organ case, the big organ case, and 50 odd wooden pipes. So it's a very exciting survival of historic pipework. But most of what you can see in the Chaircase, they are dummy pipes, as I will show you. But some of them, the big ones, do speak. The big one in the middle has always been a dummy pipe, and it is reckoned that this is a copy of an organ case in Brittany, because during the turmoil of the Civil War, Thomas Harris, needing to earn a living, went over to France, where they weren't smashing organs and smashing cathedrals, they carried on as normal. Brought you upstairs to the organ loft, and this is the back of the chair organ, and I thought I ought to explain, although many people know this, why this is called the chair organ. Because originally the organist sat here and the keyboards were here. And somewhere here the organ historian Dominic Gwynn found a board with the stop holes which belonged to this instrument when it lived over there, and there was 6, so it was very, very small. But here we are, yes, and back of my seat is the chair, obvious. If you come a little closer, you can see inside. Now, I'm not going to talk about pipes, because I really don't know anything about those, but I can demonstrate that the pipes here, that look like organ pipes on the outside, are just thin strips of wood. And only these are speaking pipes. But it's a pretty good imitation from the other side. Now, our story is coming to an end. After the organ was built by Thomas Harris in the 1660s, as we know, and was moved onto this new screen in 1718. Subsequently,
the history of the organ until 1970 anyway was basically a history of mutilation, because the fashion for organs was during the 18th and 19th centuries, they got bigger and bigger, the pipes got bigger and bigger, and more space was needed. So first thing to say is that this case, which originally, when it was first built, was only 4 foot deep, that bit and that bit, expanded until it filled the whole of the organ screen where we're standing. And a lot of the, sadly, below the impost, which is what this is called, all this is new. It's been beautifully restored now, but they filled the organ loft with ugly pipes and a great big swell box over there. They even put pipes in the triforium over there. I mean, it was a splendid instrument in its various incarnations, but it looked dreadful. And in 1969, the decision was made to return the organ as far as was possible to what it was when it was left up here in 1718. And that is why it is now much shallower than it used to be. It's still bigger, and in the 1970 rebuild, they filled the space that was necessary for it to have between the two 17th century bits with pipes, 3 on this side and 3 on that side. And people always ask who the initials are. Well, the most important initial is on this middle pipe, and that is Anna Plowden, who was the genius lady who restored the pipes, did all the painting, looked after them, and it is all her work, along with her colleague Peter Smith, whose initials are also up there. And then you'll also see John Sanders, who was my predecessor, director of music here at the time, and Rafe Downs, who was the person who, with the courage to design a totally new sort of cathedral organ, and who agreed that all the pipework should be contained in this little box. Well, it's comparatively little box we call the Great Case. Just to finish with, I'll show you one thing. We've already mentioned graffiti. I doubt if it's genuine, but there's a watercolour, as I may have said, of S.S. Wesley, another of my fantastic predecessors, giving an organ lesson. And just here, on the wall, is his name. But whether or not it is genuine, who can say? It's certainly not new. There we are. S.S. Wesley, scrawled in antique writing. He may have been bored and do it, but I doubt it. I would never dream of doing such a thing.